Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Okay, so picture this, right? You're at the grocery store, and someone totally cuts you off in the parking lot for that last good spot.
Oh yeah, happens all the time.
And then they give you this look like you're the crazy one.
Oh, the worst.
Or, maybe you've got that HOA president who acts like their little rule book is like sacred text or something.
Definitely know that type.
It just makes you think, what is the deal with people who just got to be in charge, No questions asked.
Oh, right.
Well, that kind of got us thinking on a much bigger scale today. We looked through this awesome pile of stuff you all sent in. Articles, notes.
Yeah, a really interesting mix.
And we're going to try and dive deep into a pretty big question. What exactly is a dictator? What's the whole deal with dictatorship?
Exactly. Fascinating stuff, like from really dry academic definitions all the way to, historical deep dives, even a professor just answering questions online.
Yeah.
So our mission today basically is to take all that juicy info, kind of boil it down, and really try to get a handle on what it means to be a dictator.
Right.
And what life actually looks like when they're the ones calling the shots. We just want to give you a clear, no-nonsense understanding.
Totally. So in this deep dive, we're hitting four main things. First up, nailing down what a dictator and dictatorship actually are. Definition time.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll explore all the different ways these kinds of states operate, their playbook.
The phenomena.
Third, we're going to get into the, let's say, interesting question of whether someone like Trump admires dictators.
Ooh, okay.
And what that could maybe mean for the U.S. down the line, based on the sources, of course.
Right, based on what we read.
And finally, we'll just wrap it all up. Key takeaways, maybe something to think about. Ready to roll.
Absolutely. Let's do it. So starting with the basics. What is a dictator?
Yeah.
Well, at its heart, it's a ruler who has absolute power, just total control.
Absolute, no checks.
Pretty much. This isn't power that's, limited by laws or the democratic process. And often these folks didn't get there democratically.
How did they get there then?
Well, sometimes by force, taking over, that kind of thing. It's basically the opposite of how things should work in a democracy, right?
Yeah.
Where you've got free elections and the people, in theory, decide.
Right. And it's kind of telling, isn't it, that the word dictator comes from to dictate.
Yeah, exactly.
It really just paints this picture of someone who wants their way, end of story. Doesn't really care what anyone else thinks or needs. Just push the agenda.
And what's fascinating here is looking at the specific types of dictatorships. Fascism is a really important one to understand.
Okay, fascism. What makes that specific?
So it's a very particular kind of one-party state. You've got this super powerful dictator right at the top.
One party, one leader.
Exactly. And crucially, there's no separation of powers. The courts aren't independent. The government basically controls, everything.
Everything.
Mussolini, who kind of coined the term back in the 1920s, he put it pretty bluntly. Everything in the state. Nothing outside the state.
Whoa.
Yeah, think about that. The government's reach goes into areas that, in a democracy, you consider totally your own private business.
That's intense. So it's not just running the government, it's controlling, life.
Pretty much.
And it's not just inside the country either, right? I think the professor in that clip mentioned fascism is usually expansionist too.
That's right, yeah. It's often tied to this idea of taking over other places like the old empires wanted to do.
And violence. Seems like that's a big part of it.
Oh, definitely. There's often this belief that you can and should use force to get what you want.
Yeah.
Fascist regimes tend to pick out an enemy group.
An enemy? Like who?
Could be based on race, like in Nazi Germany, or maybe political views like in Mussolini's Italy or Franco Spain.
And the goal isn't just to disagree.
No. The goal is often to get rid of them, to exterminate them. The whole government kind of gears up for this violence.
Yeah.
Even regular people might be encouraged to snitch on neighbors or use violence themselves.
It's incredibly dark. Now, the sources also threw around terms like authoritarianism and autocracy. Are those just synonyms, different words for the same thing?
They're definitely related. Close cousins, maybe? Authoritarianism is a bit broader. It's a political system that often features a dictatorship, but maybe not always that classic single-party, all-powerful leader we just described.
So there are variations.
Yeah, you could have civilian dictatorships, like the fascist ones, but also military dictatorships. And, nowadays some authoritarian leaders don't quite fit that old mold of a Mao or a Hitler.
Okay, and autocracy.
Autocracy is pretty much another word for an authoritarian political system. The big contrast for both is democracy,
Right.
where the idea is people vote, and that vote decides who leads. In an autocracy, the leader's main goal is just staying in power. Doesn't really matter what the people want.
Gotcha. So dictatorship is often a key part of authoritarianism or autocracy. But how do we, practically define it? What are the red flags? How a country is run?
Well, the sources pointed out a few key things that are missing, things you'd expect in a democracy. First, dictators aren't chosen through free and fair elections where everyone gets a real choice.
No real vote. And
they're not answerable to, an elected parliament or anything. You also don't see regular elections with different parties actually having a chance to win.
So if there are elections, they're kind of fake.
Often, yeah. And crucially, there's no history of power actually changing hands peacefully through a fair vote. That Who Governs Taiwan piece you sent laid this out pretty clearly. This lack of accountability is huge.
Because in a democracy, the politicians know they could get voted out.
Right.
That keeps them somewhat in line.
Exactly. That threat is a fundamental check on power.
Right.
And it's just completely missing in a dictatorship, which, opens the door for all sorts of abuses.
Right. So it's not just about one person having lots of power.
Yeah.
But how they got it, and if there's any way to check them or boot them out. And the sources mentioned different flavors of dictatorships, too.
Yeah, different types. You've got personality cults where the leader is built up through massive propaganda to be this almost godlike figure.
Like North Korea.
Classic example. Then there's one-party rule where just one political party runs everything.
Like China.
Right. And you can also have military oligarchies where it's a small group of military leaders calling all the shots.
Junta.
Exactly. And the BBC report mentioned something interesting. Dictators often rely on a surprisingly small inner circle, maybe just a few dozen or a few hundred people, to keep their grip.
Wow, a small group holding all that power. Okay, so we've got a better picture of what a dictator is. Now, let's get into what it's actually like living under one. What are the common phenomena?
Well, one of the most fundamental things is just the concentration of power.
All in one place.
Not just political power, but often economic power, too.
Mm-hmm.
It all ends up in the hands of the dictator or, a small group of their allies, their cronies.
And that wipes out any checks and balances.
Totally. It completely goes against that whole democratic idea of separating powers, legislature, executive, judiciary. Forget about it.
Makes sense. If one person or a tiny group controls everything, there's nobody to push back or say, hey, wait a minute.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing that leads to some pretty serious limits on what people can actually do and say.
Oh, absolutely. You see a systematic crackdown on basic freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, getting together with people.
Gone.
Severely restricted, usually. Censorship becomes the norm. They use spying, surveillance, a lot of it, to control information and stop anyone from disagreeing.
Any examples from the sources?
Yeah, they mentioned how in China you can't even have, village-level elections without the Communist Party giving the okay beforehand.
Wow. Even local stuff.
And in Singapore, critics of the government can apparently face jail time or other kinds of punishment.
So even just speaking out is risky. What about those national elections you mentioned before? The ones that might be kind of fake?
Right. Well, if they even hold them, they're almost never free or fair. It's usually rigged.
How do they rig them?
Lots of ways. They might ban opposition parties, make it really hard for certain groups to vote, or just, straight up cheat with the counting.
Like stuffing ballot boxes?
Could be. The sources mention things like opposition leaders getting assassinated in Russia.
Whoa.
And the situation in North Korea where there's usually just one name on the ballot, and voting is pretty much compulsory. It's not about choice. It's a performance of loyalty.
Right, just for show. Like a Potemkin village of democracy, someone called it.
Good phrase for it.
And when those tricks, the fake elections, the censorship, when that's not enough, I guess they resort to force.
Sadly, yes. Relying on the military or the police to crush opposition and basically rule through fear is a very common tool in the dictator's toolkit.
So intimidation, violence.
Yeah, it can range from intimidating protesters to violently putting down any kind of uprising or perceived threat. It keeps people scared, keeps them in line.
Man, it paints a really grim picture. And to stop people from figuring out what's really going on, I bet there's a ton of, propaganda, alternative facts.
Precisely. Propaganda and controlling information are absolutely key weapons. They use state-run media, TV, radio, internet to paint themselves in this glowing light.
The great leader.
Right. While hiding all the bad news, any dissent, it can leave the public completely ignorant about the real situation.
Like the Nazis talking about the lying press.
Classic example. And that YouTube source talked about the modern Russian technique, the fire hose of falsehood.
What's that?
It's just blasting out a massive volume of lies, half-truths, conspiracy theories, so much noise that it just overwhelms people. Makes it hard to know what's even real anymore.
It's like trying to swat a million flies at once. You can't get them all.
Exactly. And the professor also made a good point. You know, conspiracy theories themselves aren't new. They're as old as propaganda. Using those awful anti-Semitic lies as an example of finding a scapegoat.
Right. Blame someone else, distract from the real problems.
It's a classic move. And, you know, when you have this total lack of accountability, all that power in one place, corruption seems almost inevitable.
Oh, for sure. No one watching the hen house or the dictator's palace, I guess. It's got to be a recipe for some very rich leaders and their buddies.
Absolutely. Without any real oversight, corruption just runs rampant. State money, resources, they get funneled to benefit this small elite, not the general public.
The Dictator's Handbook source really hit on that, didn't it?
Yeah, it stressed that this is central to how these regimes operate, rewarding the key supporters. And this control over the economy, it often leads to massive inequality, huge gaps between the rich insiders and everyone else.
And internationally. Do they just isolate themselves?
Sometimes, but they might also team up with other dictatorships, you know, form alliances, or use aggressive tactics, threats to get support or resources from other countries.
So it's this whole web of control, inside and out. Now, that YouTube professor also talked about, like, the personality traits often seen in dictators. What came up there?
Yeah, that was interesting. According to her, narcissism is a big one. Thinking they're incredibly important, only really caring about themselves.
Makes sense.
Ego, huge egos, yeah. But also charisma. They're often good performers, good speakers, good at rallying people.
The performance aspect again.
Right. And crucially, they seem willing to do anything to stay in power. Absolutely ruthless.
Like the Mussolini example, having an opponent killed.
Exactly. Killing a rival, then declaring a dictatorship partly to cover it up and avoid consequences. That shows the ruthlessness. Paranoia is another common trait.
Paranoid. About what?
Losing power, being betrayed. So they often surround themselves with this tiny, super trusted inner circle, often family members.
Like Mussolini and Pinochet giving big jobs to their sons-in-law.
Yeah, keeping it in the family, people they think they can control or trust, absolutely. And, not surprisingly, they often seem to lack a real moral code.
How so?
Well, look at alliances like Hitler and Stalin totally opposed ideologies, but they made a pact when it suited them. Or Xi Jinping and Putin, now again, different long-term goals maybe, but cooperating for tactical advantage. Morals don't seem to factor in much.
Yikes. Sounds like a pretty toxic cocktail of traits.
It really does.
And we've all seen the giant statues, the pictures everywhere, the whole cult of personality. Why is that such a standard thing? It seems kind of weird.
Well, the professor explained it well. Even though they have these huge egos, dictators are often deeply insecure underneath.
Really insecure.
Yeah. So the cult of personality serves a double purpose. They need to seem like the man of the people, talking their language, connecting.
Relatable.
Right. But at the same time, they need to be this Superman figure, untouchable, powerful, almost godlike.
So both ordinary and extraordinary. How does that work?
It's a performance. The statues, the pictures everywhere. It helps create this image of permanence, like they'll be there forever. And omnipresence, they're always watching.
Creepy.
Totally. And think about rituals like the Hitler salute. The professor pointed out how that forced people to constantly show submission, constantly be reminded of the leader, even in just everyday greetings. It invaded social interaction.
Wow. So this contradiction, relatable and superior, it's deliberate.
Absolutely. It's a key strategy. Get popular support by seeming like one of the people, but demand unquestioning obedience because you're also above everyone else. It silences critics from both angles, you know?
Yeah. Hard to argue with someone who's both your buddy and your god. Weird. Okay, so thinking about holding on to power when people might not actually like you, the authoritarian playbook came up. What are the key moves there?
The professor laid out a few main tactics. One big one is just constantly attacking journalists and anyone critical. Calling them fake news, enemies of the people, vermin, communists, whatever, sticks. The goal is just to destroy trust in any source of information that might make the dictator look bad.
Like the Nazi lying press idea again?
Exactly. It's an old trick. Another huge tactic is creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation.
Through violence?
Sometimes actual physical violence against opponents, yeah. But also through things like constant lawsuits, harassment, spreading vicious rumors, online smear campaigns.
Do I do that?
To encourage self-censorship. If people are too scared to speak out, too afraid of the consequences, then the dictator doesn't have to actively silence them as much. They silence themselves.
That's chillingly effective and
Yeah.
terrifying.
Yeah.
Controlling the narrative by making people afraid to talk.
Precisely.
And the source material also mentioned some other disturbing trends in certain dictatorships, like making abortion illegal. What's the connection there?
Yeah, the professor noted that some dictatorships, he mentioned China, Russia, and others with these kind of national purity ideas like Hungary, tend to criminalize abortion. And they push women to have more babies, basically, for the state. They see it as a woman's duty to produce children.
So it's about controlling women.
Fundamentally, yeah. It's about controlling women's bodies, their autonomy, their ability to make choices about their own lives. In these kinds of regimes, women, journalists, LGBTQ plus people, they're often framed as enemies of this strong man leader.
It all seems to tie back to this theme of total control, doesn't it? Over everything, even personal choices.
It really does.
Okay, one last thing on their tactics. Rallies. Big rallies seem like a dictator staple. What's the point? Just a big party.
Hardly. Dictators use rallies for a couple of main reasons. First, yeah, it's agitation, stirring up excitement and loyalty among their base.
Getting the crowd fired up.
Exactly. But maybe even more importantly, it's for show, for the cameras. These rallies are carefully staged to look like overwhelming, massive popular support.
So it's optics.
Huge part of it. Dictators crave that visual proof of their popularity and power. The professor mentioned Hitler feeding off crowd energy and historical figures like Mobutu in the Congo using these giant rallies as just blatant displays of power, showing they were everywhere.
Right. It's all starting to form a pretty clear and frankly kind of scary picture of what dictatorships are about. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Talk about something more recent, maybe a bit controversial.
Okay.
Does someone like Donald Trump admire dictators? And what could that mean potentially for the future of the U.S., again, based on the sources?
Well, yeah, the YouTube source definitely brought this up. It suggested that President Trump has shown a certain affinity, maybe, for autocrats and dictators.
How so?
Well, he's been seen praising leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, calling them strong leaders. And he even talked about exchanging love letters with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, which is, well, not typical diplomatic language.
Yeah, love letters with Kim Jong-un definitely raises an eyebrow, especially for a U.S. president.
Right. It makes you wonder about the perspective there.
And the professor also mentioned some research about, like, how many people in any population might have authoritarian leanings.
Yeah, that was interesting. Studies apparently suggest maybe around 30% of people in any given population might have these underlying authoritarian tendencies.
30%? Wow. How does that show up?
Could be in parenting styles, views on authority, valuing order over freedom, things like that. And the concern the professor raised is that skilled manipulators, demagogues, can tap into those feelings.
Activate them somehow.
Exactly. She argued that Donald Trump, over the years, has appealed specifically to groups who are comfortable with that kind of authoritarian context, creating what she called a big tent for various extremist groups.
So people who already lean that way are drawn to a leader promising strength and order.
That's the dynamic she described. They're kind of seduced by that promise, especially in uncertain times. It becomes a cycle, reinforcing those views.
Okay. And the term self-coup came up in relation to Trump. What is that exactly?
A self-coup, or autogolpe in Spanish, it's basically when a leader who's already in office tries to stay in power undemocratically.
Like refusing to leave.
That's a prime example, yeah. Refusing to leave office after clearly losing an election. The professor specifically pointed to Donald Trump's actions surrounding the January 6th Capitol insurrection as, in her view, an example of a failed self-coup attempt.
Wow, that's a really serious accusation. A leader trying to overthrow the system that put them there.
It's a very chilling concept, yeah, undermining democracy from within.
So when we see these seemingly friendly interactions between Trump and some dictators, are those genuine friendships or something else?
Well, the professor's take was that relationships between dictators are almost always transactional, purely business.
Just deals.
Pretty much. She used the Putin-Trump example, noting that even while they appeared friendly, Trump was apparently being mocked on Russian state TV as a useful fool.
Ouch.
Yeah, it kind of illustrates the manipulative nature of it all. Dictators are looking out for, number one, their own interests, period.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Less about admiration, maybe more about strategy or seeing potential leverage.
That's likely closer to it, yeah.
And the professor also mentioned some, let's just call them ambitious, ideas Trump has floated.
Yes, she tied his perceived authoritarian leanings to some ideas that sound kind of imperialistic.
Like what?
Like suggesting Canada should become the 51st U.S. state or the U.S. taking control of Greenland.
Seriously. Greenland?
Yeah. She suggested it hints at a mindset that maybe doesn't fully respect traditional ideas of national sovereignty and independence.
Definitely gives you something to think about there. Okay, one last thing on this whole area. The internet. We know it connects people, but it's got a dark side too, right, in this context?
Oh, absolutely. The internet is definitely a double-edged sword here.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, it lets dissidents, people opposing the regime in repressive places, get their message out to the whole world, like protesters in Moscow live streaming their own arrests. That's powerful.
Right. It bypasses state control sometimes.
But on the other hand, it's also made it way easier for dictators to centralize their propaganda and spread it incredibly fast, incredibly wide.
So they use it too.
Oh, yeah. The professor pointed out that savvy dictators have always used the latest media tech. Mussolini had newsreels, Hitler mastered radio.
Right.
Modi in India uses holograms, apparently. And Trump was incredibly effective using social media. The internet just turbocharges the speed and reach of propaganda.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? Technology itself is neutral. It's all about how people choose to use it.
Couldn't agree more.
So, wow, we have covered a ton here, from defining dictators to their tactics, the whole playbook, and even touching on potential implications closer to home. Let's try to wrap this up. What are the main takeaways from this whole deep dive?
Okay, quick summary. Dictators, rulers with total power, usually got there undemocratically, not bound by laws or elections. Key features of their states. Power all in one place. Freedom's crushed, elections are often a sham, they use force or threats, and they control information heavily with propaganda. Oh, and corruption is usually widespread, plus that whole cult of personality thing, building up the leader.
Right.
And understanding this stuff matters, right? Because dictatorships often lead to really awful social injustice, human rights abuses.
Yeah.
And they can cause democratic backsliding, even influence stable democracies.
Right.
It really highlights why we need to be vigilant against propaganda and maybe learn from democracies that have managed to stay strong.
Right. It's not just some academic concept happening somewhere else. It has real world impacts and potentially implications everywhere. So on that note, here's maybe a final thought for everyone listening to chew on.
Okay.
Given everything we've talked about, these historical patterns, the modern tools like the internet, how can we, as individuals, as societies, stay alert? How do we guard against democratic principles getting eroded or authoritarianism creeping in, even in places where we think, did never happen here?
That's a really good question to ponder. Definitely something to think about. And hey, on a totally different, much lighter note, if you're looking for something fun, check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. It's called Mickytolife.
Oh, yeah, Micky.
Yeah, I hear there's some really fun stuff happening over there. So, check it out if you get a chance.